we want to talk about how a component's lifecycle works, and we're going to do that in this one on a very basic level. Now, this actual component, if you render it out in app.js like we have here, you can just really see it, and this is what it looks like. Right, so when you render a component, what you're essentially doing is mounting and inserting that component into the DOM. So unlike just writing out the HTML here, right? So like if I were to write out the HTML, it'd look exactly the same, but I'm using JavaScript to do that for me, right? So JavaScript is inserting and mounting this particular component on this page. Now, if I, went to a different page or I mounted a different component, this one may be unmounted. So that's kind of the key here with the lifecycle of this component. We have mounting and unmounting. It's sort of like entering and exiting, or rendering and unrendering. Those things are fairly interchangeable, but in the sense that we mount a component when we want to use it and we unmount it when we're done using it. That's essentially how I would put it. So there are a few things on the docs that I wanted to point out, because how the life cycle of a component works does change over time, and React's no different. So if we actually scroll down inside of the React component docs, we see this mounting portion here, right? So we have this mounting when it actually gets into the DOM or into the document, into the HTML. It goes through these different methods. And then when it's updating, it goes through a few others. And then when it's unmounting, it goes through one. And then we also have one for error handling. So we're going to go through some of these right now. And the first and foremost one is what we have here, render. Render absolutely has to be there. It's the only method that actually has to be called on our component. It has to happen every single time. Otherwise, we have an error with our component. So this is, in other words, just telling React what this component looks like. I mean, even if it doesn't render anything, which I'm not sure why you would not have it render anything, but even if it didn't, it would, still have to be there. So the render method would still have to be there, and perhaps it's just returning an empty string, right? And when we do that, empty. So what's actually happening? Like, how does the ordering of this matter? Well, if we go back into the docs, we see the ordering is written here. This is the actual ordering. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it in here. And we've got our constructor. We have this get derived state from props. I think that's a little bit more advanced, so we're not going to cover that right now. Then we have render. Again, render has to be in there, so we can ignore that as well. And then finally, component did mount. So that would actually come after render. So you may have already seen these things before. But what you also might see is something called component will mount. This is actually an older method that used to be working, or used to work, but now it's considered legacy and you shouldn't use it. You should avoid using it, and I'll get into in just a moment. So I'm just going to comment that out in just for now. Okay, so the constructor. This is the base of our component. Like, what defaults do we want to set here, right? So if I did props, which is one of the arguments that come in by default, you have to run super props, right? So now I can set any sort of initial things that I'd want here. So such as this.state equals to, whatever initial state you want to have. So like loading being to true, okay? And then render could render things out. So it could render out what that initial state would be. And this is where component will mount was at one point used for, right? Component will mount often would set that initial value. It would set that initial state, but now that's used in the constructor exclusively. So you wouldn't use component will mount for pretty much anything. You just use the constructor. Fairly simple, fairly straightforward. And then with our render, we can return all sorts of things here, right? So I can actually have a method that sets my loading. So I could do const and say loading, and this will map into my state. So this.state. Of course, you can use props. You could use all of that stuff and just do h1 and loading h1. Let's close that off and put our curly brackets in here. So we save that, and we see that we have a component did mount. Oh, we didn't need to have those braces or the curly brackets. You definitely need to have those in there. Otherwise, you get an error like that. So we've got our loading state in here. And what do you know? It's not actually giving me a true or false value. So what I would just say here is just saying something like, if loading state is true, then say hello world. Otherwise, say false or whatever, right? So that would render out exactly the way you may want it to. So what I can also do is this componented mount method. This is where I can change this state. I can also call async code or code to, call the backend. So API related code, all of those sorts of things you could call in this componented mount. But your initial state would most likely be loading, right? So you'd have it somewhat loading. And then when it mounts, that's then when you would call the backend. You wouldn't call it in the constructor because it's all about mounting. You want to have that happen as quickly as possible. And also, this is just a best practice that's in the docs quite a bit, is having componented mount will be a lot more efficient of a component itself if you have the API code call it there. So then you would just do something like this, .set state, and you would change the state to whatever you want. So loading false, right? So I'm initializing the state as one thing, and then I'm loading it as something else. So I refresh in there. It doesn't seem like anything happened, but all of this still happened. As a user, what you actually are getting is this, right? So this is what's actually happening. We've got our constructor called first. It renders out that initial state, and then it goes to componented mount, and then renders out that initial or that new state all over again. And so it re-renders after the componented mount method is called. I mean, that's an optional thing. You don't have to do it. So if you leave this empty, you're doing two redundant things. So you probably don't actually need it then, and you shouldn't actually have it. So get rid of empty componented mount methods here. So that is the mounting of portion of the lifecycle. So what do we do when the actual component changes? So this is another portion of it, right? So when it updates. I'm actually not going to go through these methods themselves because you can go on the docs and check them out yourself. And also, I don't have a really solid example that I could do right now. If you want to see that solid example, go back to when we did some sorting stuff. It's a few videos ago. You'll be able to see how that works with this post detail. So we've got this componented update method. We've actually did implement that in a different one. So that's an updating portion. But the final thing is component will unmount. Okay. So of course it is different than the component will mount. Component will mount is, it's still going to mount. It's still going to render it. It hasn't done it yet. And component will unmount is it's going to go away. Not that it did, but it's going to. So there is actually no component did unmount, at least at this point. There might be in the future, and there might have used to be. But as far as I know right now, component will unmount is the only one where it's leaving. So this can actually call a few different things, but one of the main ones is if you use something called observables, which I haven't covered yet, you could actually unsubscribe here. This is where you would unsubscribe from an observable. Or if you wanted to log something, you could send it here as well. Like so different actions that maybe occurred on this component and you want to log it to the backend. Perhaps you could do it here. You also might do it when that action occurs. It's a little bit different for everything, but this is essentially the lifecycle, and that's it. And this is actually the order that it happens too. So I do have render here twice, merely as an example. But that is how the lifecycle works. And I do encourage you to play around with it and also try these different methods that are there. There is another piece of the lifecycle that is if an error happens in it. So if there's any problems with the constructor of a child component, it will actually have this method being called. If you don't implement it, it's not going to call that method because it is an optional method. Don't think that this method here of componented catch is the same as calling an error when you do an API call or something like that. It's not the same there. Although it might actually do something, it's not the same as handling that error. It's just a different one. This is related to the lifecycle of the component. itself. So check out the docs, see that there are various things that have been deprecated or now considered unsafe after doing more and more research and learning about React. That's what they do. They learn about these things and update the code and then also update the docs. So this will be your friend in the future because it's possible that, I don't know, component didn't mount is no longer a safe thing. Maybe they change it and have something new. I'm not sure if that will happen specifically, but it is very possible because component will mount was used fairly often, and you'll see it quite often in various tutorials online or in videos. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to get everything. I'm going to be doing a lot more React type of videos. This one, I realized we didn't actually cover a whole lot of the nitty gritty. It was just much more about the general things with a component. One little bonus thing that I will mention, and this is in the documentation, is you don't actually want to make your own custom components where there's inheritance. In other words, I don't want to import this Lifecycle app or component rather. I don't want to import this on another one and use that in lieu of React. You don't ever want to do that. You always want to import from the React component itself. And that is part of this Lifecycle thing because every once in a while you might be tempted to do that. Just don't do it.